Welcome to Becoming America. This is the ninth in our series of 17 conversations about the Constitutional Convention, which took place in 1787 and drafted our Constitution. Our purpose is simple: to educate, inform, inspire, and even entertain as we learn about the men who wrote the Constitution and the issues they faced in the process. With me are my colleagues, the Honorable Judge Jim Gray and Dr. Joellen Chatham. Joining us is Dr. Bryan Santin from Concordia University, Irvine. I will tell you more about him later. As always, we begin our session with a song from the new musical Convention, The Birth of America. Convention tells the story of the Constitutional Convention in music and lyrics and provides the background for our discussions. It was written by Stephen Lawless, Joel Henry Stein, and our own Honorable Judge Jim Gray. Jim, today we're going to play Do We Dare? What should we be listening for?
Well, Bijan, as you know, last week we played the finale of the first act, and it was The Power of Hope. Now we're opening up the second act and really taking on the fundamental issue, which is, shall we go with Jeffersonians, which means very little federal power, or with Hamiltonians, which means really quite a bit, a strong federal presence. So this is introducing this. And by the way, and I'm going to do something I haven't done yet in this series, I'm going to read to you Ben Franklin's introduction in the script to Do We Dare? So it says that Ben Franklin, again flamboyantly dressed, brought on stage riding a Chinese sedan chair, and while modeling his attire, says to the audience, "I say hello again. Eat to please thyself, but dress to please others. So are you pleased?" Well, as you have seen, we've been making some progress in this hot and humid convention hall, but some of our delegates were still strongly protesting the secrecy of the proceedings, as well as some of the proposed outcomes. Hamiltonians Federalists were still pushing hard for a strong and powerful national government, while others, Jefferson's anti-federalists, which really made them look pretty negative, wanted most of the power to remain with the states and out of federal hands. But, and maybe this is a bit catty, since Hamilton really wanted his place in history, he would have been flattered to know that he would eventually have his face prominently on the $10 bill. Is that really being phased out, he says. But at least at the moment, that would have made him happy, particularly since Jefferson's face would be only on the $2 bill, and really only a few collectors had any of those. Of course, our real hero, George Washington, would be on the $1 bill. That's a lower denomination, but that means that his face would be on with everyone young and old, rich and poor, almost all of the time. And that was the way it should be, so Hamilton would be okay with that. But what would have really upset him was the knowledge that my rotund and rather pleasant face would be on the $100 bill, 10 times that of Hamilton's worth. Oh, that would have really tangled his curly locks of hair, so let's just keep it between us. In the meantime, the practical and philosophical problems and self-examinations continued as the delegates negotiated, sometimes heatedly, and tried to resolve the problems before us on the convention floor. Okay, sometimes they were learned blockheads, but a learned blockhead is a greater blockhead even than an ignorant one. Nevertheless, and fortunately, I think we again showed that energy and persistence conquer most of the problems, as long as we were willing at times to compromise. So now they're talking really the major thing here. Shall we overthrow the government and go to a strong central government? Do we dare to do that? And then the others on the other side, the anti-federalists, how they dare. That's what they're trying to do. So let's give it a listen and see if we pull it off.
We have gathered for our banner of self-government without a king. We must band ourselves together and pursue this noble thing. But our passions won't give birth to a land of prosperity. We must strive upon this boldly to set a path for eternity. Do we dare? Do we dare? Oh, do we dare? So we must strengthen achieve God's plan when day is done. So light the flame and stir the passions once again for what we seek. A mighty hand is what is needed to make strong what now is weak. Do we dare? Do we dare? Oh, do we dare? How they dare to bring together delegates from far and near, with the guise to mend what's broken, but sovereign change is what we fear. They have us meeting all in secret, so their plots will not be known. We're the ones who must stay steadfast to the freedom we have sown. How they dare, how they dare, oh, how they dare. We have fought a revolution to be rid ourselves of kings, but what now they seem to strive for are these dictatorial things. We have fought with blood and treasure and won our freedom with all to share, and now they strive to take it from us. Oh, how they dare, how they dare, oh, how they dare.
Okay, that was beautiful. Jim, there's so much in that song about the task facing the delegates to the convention. Some of these we have discussed in past sessions, and we will address many more in the weeks to come. But the song also raises some practical points. How would the convention operate? What power did it have? Should the meetings be open to the public? To help us answer these and other questions is our guest, Dr. Bryan Santin. Dr. Santin was with us earlier when we talked about what the United States was like in 1787. Dr. Santin is professor of English at Concordia University, Irvine. He teaches courses in American and world literature, history, political theory, composition, and rhetoric. His research interests focus primarily on 20th and 21st century American literature and politics, especially in relation to race and ethnicity. He received a PhD in English from the University of Notre Dame in 2017. His new book, Post-War American Fiction and the Rise of Modern Conservatism and Literary History, 1945 to 2008, will be available next spring. Dr. Santin, welcome. Let me ask the first question from you. When the Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia in May of 1787, how did it operate? What procedures and rules did they use? How did they devise those rules?
Well, thank you again, everyone, for having me. I think the first way to think about this is that the Constitutional Convention was supposed to convene earlier. It's supposed to be May, mid-May, May 14th, 1787. But not enough of the delegates had arrived, and that was mostly because of poor travel conditions. And so it's really not until May 25th that you get a quorum of 7 states that the convention can then begin in the Pennsylvania State House, what we now know as Independence Hall. One of the first things that they had to do was they had to choose a presiding officer, and that was unanimously elected George Washington. We can talk about his role a little bit later. And then the convention had to adopt rules to govern its proceedings. After accepting the credentials of the newly arrived delegates, they turned to the report of the committee charged with proposing rules for the convention. George Wythe of Virginia was the one who presented them. There's a lot of them, but I would just link a few important ones for you. First, each state would have one vote, and that was to protect some of the smaller states and to give them more voice. The minutes of the previous day's meeting would be read immediately after the president and the delegates were seated. When speaking, every member had to rise and address his remarks to the president. If two members rose at the same time, the president was the one who would decide who would speak. And the president or any member may be called to order, and the member may, quote, be allowed to explain his conduct or expressions supposed to be reprehensible. So a lot of interesting rules, and then I'll leave you with one of the most important ones. Pierce Butler and Richard Speight from South and North Carolina, respectively. They raised two particular issues with the Rules Committee. Speight moved that votes on particular subjects should be open to revision. And this is very important because if it's open to revisions, then decisions adopted early might be revised or changed. And so that produces the beginning for confidentiality. And so the idea that they are meeting and discussing in secret becomes an important issue and then later a controversial issue.
Dr. Santin, as I said, or we sang in the song, Do We Dare? They really did set it up, in effect, to dare to change our form of government. And of course, they each explained it. But we say sovereign change is what we fear. Was it actual? Were we historically accurate in the song?
Yeah, I mean the big issue is how much authority does the Constitutional Convention have? Did the Confederation Congress under the Articles of Confederation authorize the delegates to change the Constitution? And the simple answer is really no. When the congressional call for a convention was constructed, it was constructed very narrowly. And it's the stated purpose was for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And so that concept of revising them is very different than proposing a brand new constitution. However, during the proceedings, it becomes very clear that revision will not be enough.
Well, at least it wasn't a conspiracy per se, maybe at the beginning, but they did set up a ratification process and the states did ratify it. So I guess after the fact, they ratified it and it was then legal. Fair enough?
Yeah, some of the anti-federalists actually had a problem because under the Articles of Confederation, to have that level of change, you would have had a unanimous vote from all the states under the Articles of Confederation. And that was not what the ratification committees set up. So there was still some bad blood, some controversy over that.
Well, should we now bring a lawsuit to say, wait a minute, back in 1787 and 8, it should be turned over and we should go back to the Articles of Confederation?
I would think no, but there are some people that are very critical of the Constitution who will bring that up, and they will say the Constitution is illegal from the beginning or something like that. I think that's a bit of a stretch.
So, Bryan, now that we're not going to file a lawsuit turning around the decisions made in 1787, I'm sure our viewers would want to know something about some of the details, like how many delegates were appointed, how many delegates actually attended, did they all attend all the sessions? On average, how many of the delegates were present at the proceedings at different sessions?
Yeah, great questions. So the states had originally appointed 70 representatives to the convention, but some appointees either didn't accept outright, like Rhode Island famously, or they could not attend. So that left 55 delegates to actually come and attend the sessions, some of the sessions of the Constitutional Convention. Only 39 delegates actually sign the document. And then on a typical day, you have somewhere between 30 and 40 who are there. Madison makes a special effort to be there as much as possible and also to sit in the front so he can take his famous notes. And as I tell my students, there's a bonus points quiz, a bonus question, I should say, at the end of the final. What are the only two men to sign the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution? And it's Roger Sherman and Robert Morris, which is an interesting little fact.
You mentioned James Madison. Earlier in this series, we were actually able to interview President James Madison, and he told us a lot about his role. I think that was number 4 in our series, and I would encourage people to go back and meet President Madison in his old age and his role in the Constitution. You mentioned George Washington was selected as president of the convention. What was his role? What did he do? How did he relate to the other delegates? And what was his influence?
Yeah, Washington's role was mostly nonpartisan. He oversaw the debates, looked at differing opinions of the convention members, and he would ensure order through the basically 4-month process. As far as Washington's personal opinions of the new government, he believed, we see this in his diary, that a stronger central government would be necessary to maintain order and then eventually ensure some kind of prosperity. He referred to the Articles of Confederation famously as a rope of sand, providing a quite weak federal government. He was very concerned about this as a military man, thinking of order and discipline. And he was not fully confident in the convention's ability to actually set down a foundation for the new nation. There are times in his diary where he's really unsure that this is going to work out as much as he wants it to work out, of course.
Did he participate in the debates?
Generally, no. There are some odd times, actually, where he will talk about representation and apportionment and population, and he makes these small little tidbit kind of comments, but he does not, weigh in on major compromises in the way that some people would maybe guess.
There was
Bryan, I'm sorry, Jim. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, well, there was kind of a coup, as I understand it, Dr. Santin, with regard to appointing the secretary, William Jackson, who was a pretty young guy. Who was he? Where did he come from? And who did he basically displace?
Yeah, so fascinating story. He displaces a relative of Ben Franklin, actually. And he is relatively not well off, which is interesting. Kind of makes a special case, becomes the convention secretary, has a variety of duties. He maintains the secrecy of the proceedings. He's supposed to keep official minutes, but his minutes are not great, and that's why we have to rely on Madison's notes. But probably the most important thing he does symbolically is he is sent to the Congress of the Articles of Confederation in New York, of course, with the copy of the Constitution, and he reads it out to the Congress on September 20th. So that's probably the most famous and noteworthy thing that he had done.
Perhaps a less famous thing that Jackson did was during the ratification convention. No, actually, it was before the ratification convention in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania legislature wanted to set the election for delegates to their convention and set the date for their convention, but the anti-constitutionalists refused to show up, so there wouldn't be a quorum. And the president of the assembly in Pennsylvania then sent the secretary and William Jackson out to physically bring back several members of the legislature who refused to attend, forcibly brought them back to the State House and locked the doors so they couldn't leave. And Jackson actually, I understand, lobbied for the position of secretary. So he wasn't just waiting to be appointed. He actually lobbied, including writing a letter to Washington.
Yes.
What was the purpose for Madison not trusting William Jackson's notes? Was it because he didn't trust his accuracy and diligence, or was it because he didn't trust him?
It seems that it was more the former. He did not trust his ability to take the notes because he didn't take a lot of notes, and they're very scant. One of the only other delegates that takes notes is Robert Yates from New York, who then oddly enough becomes one of the most well-known anti-federalists. But then Madison ends up taking the most accurate notes because, as he says, he sits in the front, at the very front, so he can hear everything that passes. And then he says, I tried my best not to be absent a single day. So he's right in the middle of the action, and he's also there every day taking diligent notes.
Well, Madison really was pulling the strings from what I understand. He organized it, set it up. Wouldn't have happened but for Ben Franklin and George Washington agreeing to come. But there's a lot of discussion about the accuracy of his notes. Is there not, Professor Santin, that, he took them and Jackson did not, but he didn't publish them until many, many years later. And a lot of people think he edited them to show that he was the one that had these ideas and those ideas and kind of made himself look a lot better. What do you think about that conspiracy theory?
Yeah, well, he doesn't want his notes published until 1836, right? Until his death. There has been some recent scholarship that shows pretty convincingly that he did edit some of them. But I don't think it was necessarily a conspiracy. I think some of the sense of the Constitution and the importance of the Constitutional Convention enhances as we get up into the 1820s and the 1830s, and it becomes a kind of conscious revision for posterity. And so, there's a famous saying, nobody comes out second best in their own autobiography. So you might be, when you do the revisions, maybe you do make yourself look good, but it was not it was not unfair, it seems to me, that Madison's light revisions.
Have other notes been published as well? I mean, you mentioned a couple of others. Do we have them?
Yeah, Robert Yates, and then we have some secondary notes. I mean, if you consider George Washington is writing in his diaries at these times, and so we do have some of his diary entries, not exactly secretarial notes, of course, but we do have a variety of personal documents that were written during the time.
Where are they? Are they in the archives? Are they in the Library of Congress? Or where are they? Do you know the original?
I think that Washington's diaries are in the Library of Congress. I'm not sure where the original copy of Madison's is right now. I don't know if you guys know.
There are places that you can go if people are interested. There's a website called Founders Online, and be careful because there's also a Founders Online. I think it's a financial institution, so make sure you go to the right one. But you can look at all of the letters that we have, including Washington's diaries, and read all the letters from not just these founding fathers, but the people that were not even there that they wrote to. Representatives from Spain and France, and Adams and Jefferson, who were in France and England at the time. All these letters you can read, and they're fascinating because sometimes they unburden themselves in these letters, which they would never do in a public setting. So it's called Founders Online. It's a great resource.
Definitely have to visit that. Dr. Santin, there were committees involved. The convention appointed committees. Now, there's a universal convention, in other means, that makes it difficult for committees to make decisions. How are these committees formed? For what purpose? Can you tell us a little bit about some of these committees and their function and their responsibility, and how they manage the timing and the work of these committees and the outcome of their work?
Yeah, so during the 4 months of the convention, there were 12 major committees that were referred to as action committees. And each one was trying to help the convention move to the next stage in a deliberative process at first, and then a kind of decision-making process. There were some important committees later on that had to resolve some of the most heated disputes. So there's a committee of slave trade. There's a committee of the assumption of state debts. There's a committee of trade. There's a committee that is talking about representation. There's actually several committees that are talking about representation. And then you also have the committees that are interested in style and actually writing the Constitution, which was also a giant can of worms. And so the committees were designed, let's put some smaller people who are either experts or particularly interested in these issues, and let's try and have them hash this out so that we don't have to have, all roughly 30 to 40 people who were there on any given day try to hammer this out because it's too many voices at once.
What was the size of the committees, the typical size of a committee that worked, for example, on the style of the convention?
Yeah, so it would depend. Committees, the smallest committees were about 3 to 5, and some of the larger committees went usually up to about 10 or 11. And so the style committees, if I remember correctly, are somewhere around 5.
So listening to your prior comment, Dr. Santin, does this mean that in order for me to have a book that's written that's favorable about me, I'm going to have to write it myself?
Not necessarily, but if you want to ensure that it'll be favorable, then you probably want to write it yourself.
But and probably during a lot of these committee meetings, the delegates themselves, the convention was on hold. But what was the committee of a whole? As I understand it, that was one of the more prominent ones. What was it? Who was involved? Did George Washington preside over this or any other committee?
Yeah. So the committee of the whole means that the entire membership was involved in the kind of action and debate of some of the essential questions. And so this kind of decision-making stage is happening around August and September, and they're trying to fill in some of the major details and hammer out some of the major compromises for the entire convention. So the committee of the whole is a particularly interesting phase of the Constitutional Convention.
So what were those compromises? What were some of those compromises that you just referred to, Dr. Santin?
Yeah, so famously, the most famous one, of course, is the Connecticut Compromise, or sometimes called the Great Compromise, which we can go into. But some of the lesser known ones is the composition and election of the Senate, right? Is Congress going to be a bicameral Congress, or is it going to be a unitary Congress? What is proportional representation going to look like? Is the executive going to be vested in one person, or is it going to have multiple executive positions? The nature of slavery, the slave trade. There's a whole host of these kinds of compromises.
So what was the Connecticut Compromise primarily about, and how was it resolved?
So the Connecticut Compromise kind of brings together the Virginia Plan, which is famously led by Madison and Washington. And the Virginia Plan really lays down the foundation for the opening debate, right? So if you want to do well in a debate, if you can lay down the rules and you can put down the first framework, you'll probably do well. And that's what Madison does. And then you have the New Jersey Plan, which is designed to keep the interest of small states in mind, whereas the Virginia Plan is interested in larger states. So the Connecticut Compromise tries to kind of bring these together. And the major thing that it does, and it's the delegates are particularly Roger Sherman, it provides a dual system of congressional representation. So this seems obvious to us today, but in the House of Representatives, each state would be assigned a number of seats according to the proportion of their population. And then in the Senate, every state would have 2 seats. This, again, seems like a pretty interesting, pretty reasonable compromise today, but it took us a while to get there.
So I'm sure the viewers are going to ask the question, this was a competition between Virginia Plan and Jersey Plan. How was it that it was called the Connecticut Compromise? Why was it called the Connecticut Compromise?
The key reason is because of the two Connecticut architects, Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth.
All right.
You referred back a few minutes ago to the Committee of the Whole, and that was a very common, in English parliamentary history, that was a very common process used to relax the rules so that debate during the Committee of the Whole, they could be a little more relaxed. They would still take votes, but anything they did in the Committee of the Whole, and all of the members were in that quote unquote committee, but anything they voted on then had to be voted on later by the formal body. Interestingly too, Charles Pinckney, who was from South Carolina, also introduced a plan, and Madison's notes say very little about it. And yet later on, many years later, Charles Pinckney said basically the ideas in his plan were the one that became the Constitution, but that Madison left them out of his notes. Well, interesting story.
Pinckney should have written his own book. Isn't that right, Doctor?
Exactly.
Yeah, and some of the problem with trying to understand the Constitutional Convention is that we have Madison's notes, and they are the most comprehensive document, but we don't have an objective measure. We don't have a way to truly check what he had written down. So we have to kind of read between the lines, and that's always going to be, it's going to take some ambiguous reading practices.
Well, there was compromise indeed. There were many delegates that really did not trust the people per se. And one of the protections there was the Electoral College instead of the popular vote. And another one was the way that senators would be chosen. And the Constitution literally said that the senators would be chosen by the state legislatures. And only in 1913, we had the 17th Amendment that allowed it to be voted straight directly by the people. And am I correct, if you go back to the derivation of the word in Latin, Senate, it has senile in it? Is that correct?
I'm not sure about that one, But it's interesting. There's a great metaphor that Madison uses where he talks about the House of Representatives will be a popular body, and that's where you're going to have a lot of heat. That's where the hot tea is going to be, he says. Mm-hmm. And then he says the Senate will be like a saucer that catches the hot tea, cools it off, and then if you want to drink more, you can pour back in the cold tea, and then it'll kind of even it out. And so he sees the Senate as a kind of cooling body that reduces the passions, reduces the attachment to, here's a key Madison word, factions, when we're putting together a kind of Republican-minded, civic-minded government.
We may have to revise our musical convention, because I had told that story that had George Washington saying that the saucer as opposed to the cup. Was it really Madison?
I thought it was Madison. I think that was in his private papers. I have to double check on that too.
We want to be accurate, so please help me, and I'll try to change. Or I can always go to the boss, Joellen, because she knows these things.
Now, what is interesting about the Senate is that during the ratification debates, opposition to the Constitution thought the Senate was going to become an aristocratic body, and they would have that cooling effect, but it wouldn't necessarily be in favor of the people.
Yeah, and then that's one of the reasons also why there are no aristocratic titles allowed in the United States, which is also in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the Anti-Federalists are always saying that Hamilton wants to produce a secret monarchy, and they want to call George Washington king, and that was a kind of slur against a lot of the Federalists.
Well, Bryan, I'm sure our viewers want to ask the question. During these 4 months, what were some of the more colorful personalities at the convention, and what are some of the things that they did that you think our viewers would be interested to hear from you? I'm sure you know all the details of what went on during those 4 months of the convention.
Yeah, a couple interesting ones, if I could judge interest by what my students seem to be interested in when I talk about lesser known aspects of the convention. One is George Mason, who's a delegate from Virginia. So he's one of the only 3 delegates not to actually sign the Constitution. He over the process of the convention, he becomes really concerned with the kind of power that is being allotted to the federal government. And he's also interested in what seems to be at the time the convention's unwillingness to end the slave trade immediately. As we know, it actually ends January 1st, 1808. But Mason says that he would rather cut off his hand than sign the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. So even though he doesn't sign the Constitution, his fight for individual rights and for the rights of citizens, he's in a way doesn't sign the Constitution, and in a way is not that successful at the convention itself. But in terms of posterity, he becomes very important as a key voice for the Bill of Rights.
Well, as a libertarian, I'm proud to say that George Mason University is quite libertarian, and I think George Mason himself would be pleased with that.
Yes, I always have a couple libertarian-minded students who are political science majors, and it's always really interesting because they come in thinking that they are Federalists, and then they read the anti-Federalist papers and they love the anti-Federalists. It's actually it's very funny. It happens almost like clockwork, at least for one or two students.
Well, without the anti-Federalists, we would not have a Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania began its ratification process very early. They were the second to ratify, though Delaware snuck in ahead of them. But the major issue that the Pennsylvania opponents of the Constitution had was that it had no Bill of Rights. And one of their delegates, Robert Whitehill, on the very day that they voted to ratify, he submitted a list of 15 resolutions that include all of the things that are in the Bill of Rights today: the freedom of speech, press, religion, conscience, trial by jury, habeas corpus. All of these things were in his original bill, which were similar to those with George Mason's Bill of Rights that he had created for the state of Virginia. So we owe a lot to these anti-Federalists for making sure that we would end up having a Bill of Rights.
Yeah, the anti-Federalists have powerful arguments at times against not necessarily the kind of conspiracy theory that the government is trying to take everything over, but the kind of inevitable inertia that larger governments will tend to encroach upon individual rights, regardless of the virtue of the politicians, regardless even of the intention many times of politicians. These big governments have this kind of momentum that will inevitably start to infringe upon rights. I mean, when the anti-Federalists say, look, eventually, if you set up the Supreme Court to be the arbiter of the law, you are going to have a kind of judicial review, which is going to be so important that it's going to frame every other conversation, and the Supreme Court is going to become almost a kind of de facto arbiter of what constitutionality is in general. And when I talk about that with students, they're like, oh wow, that does seem like today. I mean, if you're going to solve a major issue today, a controversial issue, for instance, like something like same-sex marriage, it's going to happen in terms of the Supreme Court. It's not going to happen with the executive, and it's not going to happen with the legislative branch.
Brian, you're bringing up a really important point, because there was an article in Harper's Magazine about a year ago. It was a title article, and it was called "Is the Constitution Relevant?" That's sort of the title. And it included a discussion of 5 law professors about the role of the Constitution. The Constitution didn't fare very well. They actually said, it should be read more as poetry than a legal document. Another one said it was a lie from the very beginning, and they knew it. I take issue with a lot of what was in that article. But unfortunately today, so many people don't understand the role of the Constitution. And even during the COVID pandemic, when the governor of a particular state imposed some very strict restrictions on how people and businesses could behave, this governor was asked on national television, what about the Bill of Rights and personal freedom? And his answer was astounding. He said, "Oh, I wasn't thinking about that." That was shocking to me. And but the founders took this new Constitution and later the Bill of Rights very seriously. They knew this is the supreme law of the land. This guides everything we do.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought up that Harper's article, because when that came out, I actually assigned it as extra credit. It was optional if they wanted to read the article and produce an argument. And I think actually the ones who did it, I mean, they were the more self-motivated students, and they all argued against the Harper's article as well. They also all took issue with the Harper's article, because I mean, I think some of the critiques of the Constitution that are leveled today come from this very presentist perspective, where we see portions of the past. We have a kind of moral clarity that they didn't have. That if you put yourself in their position, was much more difficult to try and understand. I always say, to mercilessly critique the past is to open us up today to be mercilessly critiqued by the future, hundreds of years in the future. And we will all probably, we will not pass the moral tests of the next centuries, even though, we are trying our best.
Good observation. Bryan, this is, we're talking now about Song 9, which is the first song in the second act, Do We Dare? Song 5 was a pivotal one as well. What About Me? Talking about the various people that were left behind. And they were criticizing the delegates to the convention, saying they are well-read, well-bred, well-fed, and well-wed, which I think is a great piece of prose. I wish I could take credit for it, but this was actually from history. But tell us a little bit about the delegates. Were they, because it was amazing how well schooled they all seemed to be with regard to ancient Greece and Rome and Hobbes and Locke and that sort of thing. But tell us a little bit about some of those delegates.
Yeah, so most of the delegates had participated in the revolution. As Joe Ellen says, some of the major early ones like John Adams and Jefferson are not there, but they are both. On the one hand, they are very well educated, but they also have a lot of practical experience in the revolution. And so you have this amazing kind of perfect storm of historical factors coming together at once. You have a revolution, and then you have the aftermath of the revolution, in which you have the ability to construct a constitution. And then you have these men that are incredibly well schooled in the history of free government, or, as Madison would say, he calls it like the bright shining star of free government. It kind of flares and then it dies. And so there's this just incredible list of factors that you have people like people like Madison and George Washington, and even George Mason and William Patterson and James Wilson and some of these lesser known guys, who do pull off almost something like a historical miracle, I think.
My personal view is that the Articles of Confederation was a necessary bridge. That yes, they were revolutionary. They wanted to overthrow the tyrant. They did not want a strong government, et cetera, et cetera. Had they proposed the Constitution in 1778 or so, it never would have been ratified. Do you share my conclusion?
Yeah, I would. I don't see how you're in the middle of a revolution. How are you going to set up this well thought out governmental structure that's going to bring together a confederation who is confederated against a common enemy? The colonies are not coming together and saying we all have the exact same positive interests. We have the same negative interests against King George. So yeah, I do think that the Articles of Confederation are really important. One of the things that's important is it says the Articles of Confederation in basically the preamble says we will produce a perpetual union among these confederated colonies. And so that perpetual union produces, I feel like, the imaginative spark that then allows people to further imagine a tighter union later. But yeah, the Articles of Confederation, if you're if you're interested in not having a strong central government and you're interested in putting together a kind of league of friendship, they did exactly what they were designed to do.
Well, as I understand it, prior to the Constitutional Convention or the ratification of the convention, the words United States of America was plural. And after it was ratified, the United States of America was deemed to be singular. I think that pretty well describes it. Do you agree?
Yeah. I actually, I published an article in American Quarterly several years ago where we used some digital humanities, computer coding technology to look at the grammatical singularization actually of the United States. And it is referred to almost always in the plural. And then it starts to become more singular in the 1800s, and it becomes almost exclusively singular, not until about 20 or 30 years after the Civil War, actually.
The Articles created a perpetual union. And when you read the preamble of the Constitution, it says that it is to create a more perfect union, because the union was not perfect. And I think James Wilson, who you referred to a minute ago, who was a delegate to the convention, became a member of the Supreme Court appointed by George Washington. I think he put it very well in the fall of 1787 after the convention had adjourned. He said, "We are creating a nation." This was a new idea. These had been 13 original colonies that viewed themselves and called themselves countries. So now we're the United States, but Wilson said that we are putting together a nation. And from that, he said we should develop a national character. Every nation has a national character with its own language, its manners, its customs, its personality. And I thought he phrased it beautifully. Sorry, Bijan, go back to you.
Yes, sure.
No, I was just going to say, I'm going to ask Dr. Santin to comment on the point that you just raised. But, you mentioned COVID. 100 years from now, our audience are going to watch our program, which is being recorded in the year 2020. Dr. Chatham said something, COVID. What is COVID? So I thought maybe we stop and you say a few words about what were you talking about when you said in these COVID days? What is happening in America in 2020 may be interesting to people who would watch this program many years from now. So I thought maybe
sadly it wasn't happening just in America. It was around the world. This was a virus that emanated in China and spread throughout the world, extremely contagious. Millions of people are affected. Millions have died. We compare it to the Spanish flu back in the early part of the, I guess around 1914, 1917, in that period of time. And so that was what we're referring to.
Brian,
and it changed our lives. It changed our lives, didn't it?
May I throw in that I recently saw a man wearing a T-shirt that said, "Please make Orwell fiction again." And that's what we're living in 2020. But that, I think, describes it too.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, everything that has happened in terms of the suffering of COVID is a tragedy. But from an academic and theoretical angle, it is producing these incredibly deep questions about federalism, and it is throwing back into relief the relationship between the states, particularly the governors, the powers they have, the powers that they don't have, in relation to the express powers of the federal government as well. And I think it's going to take us, probably a few decades for political scientists to comb through the data, to comb through the archives, and to see how the Constitution stood up and how its federalist system stood up to this.
Bijan, in response to your question, the governors of states who have extraordinary emergency powers in many cases, were telling businesses how they could operate, what hours they could operate, how many employees could work at a time, how many customers could be in a building. And there were also social media that was refusing to report dissident reports on the medical aspects of this. So there were a lot of issues faced with COVID. Another issue faced in 2020, this year, we had a presidential election. And there were charges by the losing candidate, which was the President of the United States, Donald Trump, who claimed that throughout the states there was fraud and illegal behavior going on that usurped his right to be elected President of the United States. Which brings up a point not about the fraud or the alleged fraud, but the fact that federal elections are actually conducted by the states. Every state decides how the elections will take place. They decide who the eligible voters are and so on. And again, we often forget that our own national elections are conducted by the states. So reading the Constitution and understanding is really important.
Dr. Chatham, Judge Gray, Dr. Santin, they say all good things must come to an end. And we have arrived at that point. We've covered a lot of grounds today. Thank you, Dr. Santin, for having this conversation with us. And thank you, Judge. And thank you, Dr. Chatham, for always providing the best in education and hopefully a little bit of entertainment. I believe we now have a good idea of how the Constitutional Convention actually worked. Bryan, thank you. Thank you again. You did a great job in sharing with us and our audience exactly some of the details that went on, and I'm sure everybody's interested in knowing. Now, for the audience, if you are interested in reading a day-by-day account of the convention, you can go to the blog Becoming America by going to Concordia University Irvine Center for Public Policy. Each day's read is about 4 minutes, and it's well worth it. I recommend you go there and read the day-by-day account of the convention. You can also hear the song Do We Dare and the other songs again. And all of the songs from convention by logging on to judgejimgray.com. So join us, please, next time when we listen to My Country Needs Me and have a conversation about the founders and their overriding concern to protect liberty. Thank you for joining us, and join us for the next session.